Thank you very much, Greg. The next and last speaker this evening is Joshua Blakeney. Joshua is a graduate student at the University of Lethbridge, a member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and as we all know, a 9/11 activist. He's a staff writer at Veterans Today. He is also now the Canadian correspondent for Press TV, which I'm sure many of us have heard about. Joshua has made numerous appearances on radio and television discussing current events. His talk tonight is entitled The Likudnik Origins of 9/11. Thank you, Joshua.
Yes, please raise your right hand. Please state your name.
Joshua Blakeney.
Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
What are your credentials to establish your expertise in the 9/11 area? You may tell the audience.
Okay, yeah, I enrolled in a sociology degree, sociology studies at the University of Lethbridge in 2006. And by 2007, I had walked into Professor Anthony James Hall's globalization studies classes. And at that time, he was beginning to revisit the literature on 9/11, having been prompted by Splitting the Sky, who had gone through the 9/11 evidence. And because he's a serious academician, Professor Hall had the humility and integrity to rethink his position on 9/11. I think as an Indigenous Studies prof, it was very attractive, the idea that the Muslim world, the colonized people, kind of got one back on the empire. And he was, able to let go of that. And I believe he was kind of sick for a few days, just grappling with the 9/11 evidence. And so by April 2010, I had culminated my sociology degree. Was still a committed Marxist, having gone through the postmodern, education that sociology departments offer these days, where they reject the kind of modernist paradigms that did so much for humanity. And Professor Hall suggested that I pursue graduate studies, do an MA degree addressing what we entitled The Origins of the Global War on Terror. And I was quite lucky that the dean at the graduate school, there was a new appointment and it was a sociology prof, and I'd been top of the class, so he kind of liked me, and so we had all the infrastructure in place and the context for doing an MA thesis on 9/11, and so that's what we engaged in. And Professor Hall is, he's in the saddle. He teaches every Wednesday night a 3-hour class, and we talk about 9/11 to students among many other issues, and they find it highly compelling. And I often, in my capacity as his teacher's assistant, I do talk about 9/11 with students too. And I received the Queen Elizabeth II graduate scholarship in November 2011, and by the next day I was being assailed in the National Post by Jonathan Kay. Jonathan Kay's written 2 books in his career as a propagandist for war. One book was co-authored with a Mossad agent named Michael Ross, Hagiography of the Israeli Mossad, and he's written one book attacking the 9/11 Truth Movement. I would say that Jonathan Kay, when you look at who his mother is, an ardent Zionist, that he is one of Canada's top apologists for the Israeli regime in Canada. So I don't want to give you my life story anymore, so I'm trying to address the Likudnik origins of the war on terror. I'd agree with much of what Greg said. I'd say I don't romanticize the United States. I'm not a US patriot by any means. I'm a socialist. I'm a Marxist internationalist. Actually, Professor Hall has done a great deal of work on the American Revolution and has dealt with the kind of the factionalism that went on within the ruling class in the 13 colonies that led to the secessionist movement that founded the United States. And I would say that what Israel, the factionalism that's emerged within the ruling class today in the United States, within the American empire, is comparable and analogous to the factionalism that arose in the 18th century, where you sort of had you had London saying, we want to kind of do deals with the natives. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, you had basically, King George saying we're going to work with the natives in the Americas, because of course they were doing mercantilism. They wanted to stay near the coast, and so it was expedient for them to work with the natives. But you get these kind of romantic nationalist, manifest destiny types in the 13 colonies who seceded from the British Empire. If you read the Declaration of Independence, they say King George has brought on the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And so there you are, the first terrorists were defined, the people who, of course, were on the resources. And so likewise in the Spanish Empire, you had Simón Bolívar, who got irritated with the Peninsulares coming over and telling the Creoles in Latin America what to do. In South Africa too, you had the British wanted to stay near the coast. You read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, things weren't perfect under the British system, but he was able to get an education. And in other words, the local white elites are merely one vested interest, and the global empire has to deal with other vested interests, such as the people who happen to have a darker tan, you know, the natives in the region. And I think what's happening today is comparable. I think that the Zionists have they don't like these oil barons telling them what to do. They don't like people who are ensconced in Houston and Dallas calling the shots, you know, propping up people like Saddam Hussein, who of course fired Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. It's fine if you're living in Houston and Dallas to sponsor Arab strongmen, but if you're in Tel Aviv, that's not desirable. So I have an actual essay that I wrote for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and I wasn't going to read it, but I was going through it today, and I have such rich quotes that I think would be valuable for me to adumbrate for you. And so I'm going to proceed with trying to read this essay. So I know it can be a bit monotonous if people read an essay, so I'll try to be interesting for you, but I'm going to proceed. And so I have some quotes in this essay, which I wrote for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, called the Likudnik Origins of the Global War on Terror. So Netanyahu was quoted in Haaretz on April 16, 2008, stating, "We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." I have Naomi Klein, who wrote in The Guardian on September 17, 2004, a mainstream source, "What happened on September 11, 2001 is that the Likud doctrine, previously targeted against the Palestinians, was picked up by the most powerful nation on earth and applied on a global scale. Call it the Likudization of the world, the real legacy of 9/11. That's Naomi Klein's words, not mine. Introduction. The disputed events of 9/11 are often deemed to have served the function of furthering the interests of the American empire, sometimes referred to euphemistically as the military-industrial complex, which often is perceived to be engaging in imperialist ventures to enhance the profits primarily of big oil. Although many military contractors and some oil companies undeniably benefited in the long term from the waging of the 9/11 wars, there is neither evidence that they were the primary lobbyists for the post-9/11 wars of aggression, nor that they had complicity in the events of 9/11. When one scratches beneath the surface, it becomes clear that 9/11 and the 9/11 wars had more to do with the geopolitical imperatives of the Israeli government and their neoconservative allies, many of whom were US-Israeli dual citizens, than with the profit-driven motives of the traditional foreign policy establishment in the United States. So sociologist James Petrus, whose works were required reading when I was an undergraduate, and I understand him to be like a Marxist, but he's done, you know, so he's a very mainstream scholar whose works were prescribed to me when I was a student of sociology. And then I looked into his work on Zionism, and he has books with very provocative titles such as, you know, The Zionist Fifth Column in America and so on. He's done some really exceptional work on this, and I quote him in 2006 as having stated, "There is an abundance of evidence for the past 15 years that, one, oil companies did not promote a war policy." He actually interviewed oil companies, and they actually professed that they were against the invasion of Iraq because it, of course, jeopardized oil interests, as I'll demonstrate subsequently. The wars have prejudiced their interests, operations, and agreements with prominent Arab and Islamic regimes in the region. 3. The interests of the oil companies have been sacrificed to the state interests of Israel. 4. The power of pro-Israel lobbies exceeds that of oil companies in shaping US Middle East policy. The synthetic events of 9/11 are perhaps best viewed as having enabled a coup d'etat, which gave the Zionist faction of the ruling class the power to dictate the terms of US imperial policy, subordinating the traditional foreign policy establishment in Washington. So I'm saying it's a nouveau riche faction that have superseded the kind of ancien regime in the same way that the founding fathers of the United States took over the westward expansion in North America, or the Afrikaners, of course, ended up doing their great trek and took over South Africa, and of course were far more misanthropic in their version of colonization. With the US government being unable to prove that the events of 9/11 were orchestrated by 19 crazed Islamists taking orders from Al-Qaeda leaders ensconced in caves in Afghanistan, it becomes all the more important to have a proper understanding of who the main beneficiaries of 9/11 were and what motivated these political actors. This requires an understanding of the history of the State of Israel, the prime beneficiary of 9/11, which, post 9/11, has been able to implement a grand geopolitical strategy originally conceived in the 1980s of reordering the Middle East ensemble using US and British military personnel as cannon fodder. So this next section I've entitled The Philosophy of Israeli Empire. The ascent of Menachem Begin's Likud party to power in 1977 sowed the seeds for the events of 9/11 and the subsequent 9/11 wars. So you hear a lot of people say, you know, the 9/11 wars have their sort of genesis in Brzezinski and so on, but insofar as it hasn't been proven that Islamists or Al-Qaeda were involved in 9/11, how relevant and pertinent it is to talk about Brzezinski and his shenanigans with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is brought into question. So I would say the ascent of the Likud party in 1977, that's where we should look for the origins of the global war on terror. So the ascent of Likud sowed the seeds for the 9/11 wars, and Israel, prior to the rise of Likud, had been ruled by labor Zionists who, although rapacious and genocidal in their orientation towards the Palestinians, were ultimately pragmatists, rooted in a different philosophy to the jingoistic and more theocratic Likudniks. The Likud party has its origins in the revisionist current of Zionism, whose founder was Vladimir Jabotinsky. Revisionist Zionism distinguished itself from other political currents in Zionism in that it took a more hardlined and militant approach to the colonization of Palestine. In his book, The Unspoken Alliance, Sasha Suransky defines revisionist Zionism as a school of thought that favored the use of military force to defend Jewish sovereignty and encourage settlement of the biblical lands of Greater Israel, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Jabotinsky's maximalist conception of the Zionist state was, quote, was one that would occupy the whole of Palestine on both sides of the River Jordan, with a Jewish army efficient enough to take and keep more Arab land if necessary. So they're going into the Wild West like the settlers in the United States. So I think Jews are not unique in any way. The Zionists are doing exactly what other colonial projects have done in the past. Expansionism. So, learning from the Nazi demographic experiments, Jabotinsky overtly promoted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, stating, "The world has become accustomed to the idea of mass migrations and has almost become fond of them. Hitler, as odious as he is to us, has given this idea a good name in the world." So it's Hitlerian. Historian Ilan Peleg, in his book Begin's Foreign Policy, 1977 to 1983, states that Jabotinsky's approach to the conflict came to be dominated by popular ideas of blood and soil, a Jewish version of social Darwinism, which, as we know, was the kind of philosophy du jour in the 19th century, but shouldn't really be a palatable philosophy today, I would say, but apparently it appears to be so in certain circles. In an interview with a communist journalist named Robert Gessner in 1935, Jabotinsky stated, and I think this is an important quote, "Revisionism is naive, brutal, and primitive. It is savage. You go out in the streets, pick any man, a Chinaman, and ask him what he wants, he will say 100% of everything. That's us. We want a Jewish empire." The philosophical father of the incumbent Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. In many ways, Menachem Begin's interpretation of revisionist Zionism was more extreme. So Menachem Begin, who was the first Likud Prime Minister, was more extreme and inclined towards violence than Jabotinsky. The first Likud Prime Minister had in a previous incarnation headed a terrorist group, the Irgun, which terrorized non-Jewish inhabitants in British Mandate Palestine in the 1940s. With the inception of the Zionist state in 1948, Begin formed the Herut Party, which in 1973 merged with other right-wing tendencies in Israel to form a coalition under the rubric of Likud that could win enough votes to govern Israel on a rightist platform. Stephen Snigoski, in his magisterial text, writes, and his text is called The Transparent Cabal, because I kind of concur with Greg that actually a transparent cabal sounds oxymoronic, but actually the Zionists and the neocons pretty much said everything that they were going to do in the documents, and so it's not exactly an invisible situation here if we have the courage to deal with it. And I remind people, like in Canada we have hate speech laws, and for us to speak about this issue and not be cowards and not sell out the Palestinians, not sell out those who are the victims of Zionist genocide, I think that's important. So in his book, Snigoski says in The Transparent Cabal, with the Likud's assumption of power, the most far-reaching militant proposals entered mainstream Zionist thinking, involving militant destabilization of Israel's neighbors and Palestinian expulsion. The next subchapter I called The Evolution of US-Israeli Collaboration. The Zionist movement had always needed sponsorship from a great power for its ludicrous romantic nationalist initiative of establishing a self-proclaimed Jewish state in the heart of an overwhelmingly Muslim part of the world to come into fruition. Scholar Norman Finkelstein writes, given the anticipated and later the real resistance of Palestine's indigenous population to the Zionist project, movement leaders recognized that they could never gain a firm foothold in Palestine without the backing of one or more great powers. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 provided the Zionist movement with the great power, Britain, that they needed to realize their colonial aspirations. The Zionist movement received widespread support from the Anglo-American establishment for their colonial project. And an interesting quote from British Labour MP Richard Crossman, who said in the mid-1940s in a parliamentary speech, Zionism is after all merely the attempt by the European Jew to build his national life on the soil of Palestine, much in the same way as the American settler developed the West. So the American will give the Jewish settler in Palestine the benefit of the doubt and regard the Arab as the aboriginal who must go down before the march of progress. So as I say, I'm not really advancing the thesis that Jews are unique, superior as some Zionists would say, or inferior as anti-Semites would say. I'm just saying that the Zionists are doing pretty much what many other European colonial movements have done in history. So the US government did give Zionism the benefit of the doubt, recognizing the state of Israel within 11 minutes of its declaration of independence on May 14, 1948. The initiation of a Middle Eastern ethnic nationalist settler colony during a period when most indigenous inhabitants of the region were fighting for self-determination and a post-colonial era was a huge contradiction that would plague the world for decades to come. The aspiration of Zionists to suppress Arab self-determination and destabilize the Middle East would eventually lead us into the quagmire of the 9/11 wars, which first and foremost expedited and expanded what international jurist Francis Boyle refers to as Israel's slow-motion genocide against the Palestinians. And I do battle, with my Palestinian friends on this. It's funny because the 9/11 truth movement invariably shies away from the evidence of Israeli involvement and the evidence that, the Zionists kind of concocted the whole war on terror. And likewise, my friends in the pro-Palestinian movement who do deal with the vibrant debate that's going on, regarding does the Zionist tail wag the American dog, they negate the evidence pertaining to 9/11, proving that 9/11 was a false flag attack. So I often want to, knock the heads together of those in the truth movement who don't deal with Israel and those in the pro-Palestinian movement. I helped to found a chapter of Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights at my university. Those in the pro-Palestinian movement who do deal with that vibrant debate to do with the factionalism within the American empire right now, but who negate the evidence of 9/11. I think that's a really important project that Dr. Barrett has been pursuing for longer than I have, actually. And so, Naomi Klein would write in 2007, Israel has learned to turn endless war into a brand asset, pitching its uprooting, occupation, and containment of the Palestinian people as a half-century head start to the global war on terror. The tragedy of Zionism, mainstream Zionist historian Walter Laqueur, who's the main historian of Zionism, Walter Laqueur, he Eurocentrically laments, was that it appeared on the international scene when there were no longer any empty spaces on the world map. It's not fair, why, the Belgians had their empire, the British had their empire, why can't the Jews have their Pax Judaica? I guess it came along too late, from the perspective of the Zionists. In order to create, maintain, and expand their illegitimate space on the map, the Zionist movement always knew that they would have to attain regional hegemony, which meant that it was in the interest of the Israeli government for the inhabitants of the Middle East to constantly be feuding and quarreling amongst themselves, so they would not be fighting the Zionist cuckoo in the nest. Thus, the emergence of Arab regimes which could compete with Zionist hegemony was a major fear of the Israeli government. By 1954, Israel was mastering the art of false flag terrorism. In the infamous Operation Susannah, the Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Levon deployed Egyptian Jewish agents to explode bombs in British and American strategic locations, quote, to undermine Western confidence in the existing Egyptian regime by generating public insecurity and actions to bring about arrests, demonstrations, and acts of revenge, while totally concealing the Israeli factor. The team was accordingly urged to avoid detection so that suspicion would fall on the Muslim Brotherhood and communists, unspecified malcontents or local nationalists. Operation Susannah was one of Israel's early attempts at hoodwinking great powers into weakening its Arab enemies. Israel wanted the US to take a less accommodating posture towards Arab nationalism, for the British to retain control of the Suez Canal, which the US was encouraging them to hand over to the Arab nationalist regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser. So Israel had shown a willingness in 1954 to attack its allies in order to realize its geostrategic goals. So, those who argue that Israel is just a tool of US imperialism have to address these reoccurring contradictions between Israel's national interest as conceived by Israeli rightists and what has traditionally been conceived of by the traditional foreign policy establishment in the US as the US national interest. Many in the truth movement just won't go there because it means you have to talk about Israel, and to get called a conspiracy theorist is bad enough, but to get called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist is more than most can handle.